Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Business Ed podcast channel. My name is Phil Mattia. I am the Director of Marketing at the Feliciano School of Business. I'm here with Dr. Edmond Berisha. He's an assistant professor in the economics department at the Feliciano School. Welcome, Dr. Berisha.
Thank you so much, Phil. I appreciate it.
So we're here today to talk about a topic that's affecting all of us Americans. It's called inflation. And I think all of us have some kind of working knowledge on what inflation is. We learned it all in school. I know I did. I don't remember most of it, but it's a topic that's affecting us everywhere from gas prices to clothing to groceries. We're seeing that everything is costing more money, everything's more expensive. And what I asked Dr. Berisha to talk about here is talk about inflation and some comments about what is it, why is it going up, will it be with us forever? And of course, there's always a political aspect to inflation because both parties are kind of pointing the finger at each other. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there on social media. So it's a topic I think those of you who are listening would find very interesting. So why don't we begin with a simple question: is what is inflation?
Yes, Phil, happy to explain. So Phil, the way at least we are looking at the inflation rate is we have this general measure of consumer's price index. And in a very simple words, it just measures what's going on with the prices of baskets of goods and services that is the most consumed by people. Think about grocery stuff, housing, transportation, etc., and just keeping track of this over the time. Now, what we have seen the last 2 months, and I'm talking about May and June, we saw inflation picking up in US. And when we look at the percentage change in this consumer's price index, we are seeing inflation in May was almost 5%, 4.9% relative to the May of last year. And this June was 5.3%, which when we look at from the historical perspective, we haven't seen something like this the last, for sure the last 20 years, but also for the last 30 years. Now, that's when we talk about inflation in terms of goods and services, but how about inflation in stock market? And this is something we are seeing too. Stock prices have increased drastically over the last year, and everybody is saying the stock market is becoming expensive. So if you are a person that is worried about stock market, then pretty much inflation there is going to affect you the most. We also saw inflation in housing market too. So housing picked up pretty drastically the last year, and we are seeing the housing market also becoming more expensive here. So my understanding is we are seeing literally, Phil, inflation everywhere. So everything is becoming expensive, and to me this is a challenge now we have to deal as an economy.
So when we say inflation, from my knowledge, it has to do with supply and demand. I mean, when you mentioned some numbers, 4.9%, what does that actually mean? When what does a term mean? And you quoted some numbers here. What does that mean?
So it just means, for instance, let's say last June, you spent $100 to buy goods and services. Right now, you have to spend $105. So $5 more to get the same amount of goods and services you got last year. Now, to put it in a more simple perspective, the objective is for a stable growth to have an inflation rate of 2%, so to have a little bit of inflation. But seeing it 5.3%, that means this is getting at the territory which policymakers might start to be uncomfortable because the life is becoming expensive. So think about if you are earning the same income. Now you are earning the same income, but 5% increase in prices means now more of your income is going to go toward buying the same goods and services you bought last year.
So does that relate to cost of living adjustments? I know there was that COLA number.
Exactly. So if we are into those type of contracts, then we shouldn't feel too much the pain of inflation. So if our wages adjust to let's say this year our wages adjust to by 5.2%, then at least we are having the same standard of living as last year. But think about, Phil, if you're a first-time home buyer, and now you jump into this market, it's going to be pretty tough for you to deal with this type of prices. And especially if you are young too and you're not making sufficient income, then this inflation rate can harm. And what I find is fascinating, Phil, is this is happening in every sector of the economy. So, and my understanding is whatever we saw in financial market and housing market, I think now it's feeding into the entire economy, because again, improvement in financial market, improvement in housing market, that's a wealth, right? Whenever we feel wealthier, then we tend to spend more. And I think this is sort of a channel that we are observing now affecting the entire economy.
So the question that's debated now, and of course it gets political because everything is political in this country, is how did this happen? And I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal back on July 15th by Catherine Lucy. And in the article, she mentions House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican out of California. He tweeted, and I quote, "Inflation is running rampant due in part to out of control spending from President Biden and Speaker Pelosi." So obviously the Republicans are, their position is it's the president's fault that prior to President Biden last year when President Trump was president, gas prices were lower, groceries were less. So they're making it political. So you're an economist, and you're obviously you're not biased either way from a political standpoint. So how did this happen? How did the inflation happen? Was it the president who did it? How did this happen?
So Phil, let me explain. So I'm an economist. So I'm just going to look now at the numbers, and hopefully I can deliver the message clearly here. So look, when think about January last year when the pandemic hit. So when I checked the numbers, we lost from the pandemic. We lost think about last year, Q4 2019, and then Q1 2020, when there was the biggest effect of a pandemic. Phil, we lost roughly $2 trillion of GDP. $2 trillion of GDP. However, that's a loss in production. Think about the dollar value of goods and services we lost. But think about how much government support we got. So we got the first stimulus, which was 2.2 trillion. So just the first stimulus exceeded the loss in GDP. Then we get another stimulus, 900 billion. And then the third stimulus, which is 1.9 trillion. So when I added up the numbers, we got like a $5 trillion stimulus, which was 2.5 times the loss of GDP. So now we put all this money into the economy, which was significantly higher than the loss in the production. And personally, I believe that caused inflation. And we are seeing now the consequences of all that big money entering the economy. And personally, Phil, the way at least I'm understanding this stuff is, think about March. We got this last stimulus of almost $2 trillion, which was 1.9, but then the economy started opening up. So now, for me, I think the biggest effect on inflation is coming from the last stimulus, because we open up, but everybody was richer in terms of wealth, and now all that money is being spent in the economy as it causing prices to pick up. That's one thing. That's sort of a demand side explanation. The other explanation is the supply chains too. There was a lot of disruption because of the pandemic. And I was checking the numbers in the used cars. I don't know if you saw some articles. When I was checking the CPI data for the used car and trucks, over the last year, we have almost like a 50% increase in the prices of used car. So the pandemic caused this disruption in the supply chains, right? If I am a car dealer, I am in a lockdown, I'm not going to order new cars because I don't know where or when the economy is going to open up so I can sell those cars. Think about all these big corporation. They didn't make the orders, and now suddenly we just open up, and now this demand is chasing the limited supply that is out there, and this is pressuring prices to go up.
Your comment regarding stimulus, that was also in this article, in the Wall Street Journal article, where former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers is among, I'm quoting, is among the economists who have warned that a burst of federal spending this year could prompt unwelcome inflation. And he also brings up the infrastructure. So it's pushing more money into the economy, as you said, could have been a cause of this.
That's true. And Larry Summers warned about it. And I was checking some data too, Phil. So when you check the labor force participation, so and here we can look at it with percentage wise or numbers, but when we look as numbers, so before the pandemic, we had 164 million people in a labor force, so roughly half of the US population. Because of the pandemic, it dropped to 158 million. So, and then it picked up a little bit, but in terms of labor force, we are 4 million less than the pre-pandemic, which means labor force has shrank. So there's less labor available out there for working and production. And now that's why we are seeing a lot of companies hiring, and they cannot fill up those jobs that they are trying to fill up. So that is another thing that is causing inflation. So, and my understanding is all this money sort of created a discouragement for work, if I can say, and hopefully it's not something that's going to last. So hopefully we see people going back and joining the labor force, so we don't see this pressure in prices too. Because I think intuitively, right, if I want to attract somebody to work for me, then the best incentive is higher wage. So if labor force participation is dropping or dropped, then if I want to attract somebody, I need to offer higher wage, and that higher wage is going to feed into higher prices.
Yeah, and to your point, the labor shortage, I mean, we're experiencing it every day. I mean, something as simple as I went to my Starbucks last week and they're closed 2 days a week. And on the door, it says, due to labor shortage, we're closed Tuesdays and Thursdays. And everyone's experiencing this in different industries. But to your point regarding companies paying more to attract labor, there was an article in Forbes on July 15th, which, and I'll quote this, it was from Stephen Dudish. He said, there's one asterisk to this whole transitory inflation argument. That's wages. If corporate America feels a pressure to pay more, not just in the way of post-COVID bonuses or return to work bonuses, but in a sustained way, then we can actually get some mild to moderate inflation. Not runaway inflation, but mild to moderate inflation. So to your point about companies paying more, his point here is that it could
and for me is, Phil, yes, 5% is some sort of a moderate inflation rate, and to me is it's picking up, right? Like in May was 4.8, now 5%. So hopefully it's not going to keep increasing. But I mean, from a business perspective, right? If you have to pay somebody to come and work for you and attract with a higher wage, as a business person, you are not just going to take the entire cost and not pass it to the customer. So usually businesses, okay, it's not going to go one-to-one passing the cost, but they are going to try to pass some of that cost to customers in terms of higher prices. So now customers are the one that are going to pay for this labor shortage in terms of higher prices.
Yeah, and that's another argument that people have about raising the minimum wage to $15 or $20 an hour and making more of a livable wage as opposed to now, which is whatever the minimum wage is for that state. So I know there's arguments there on both sides of.
Phil, I've been thinking about this, and I think government just set up a price floor for wages. Because think about if you are a person, or if I'm a person that I received $600 a week for, let's say, 6 months, or I'm not so sure how long it lasted, but then if I receive that money without doing anything, staying at home. Now, if I want to go back to working, at least I should be offered a little bit something more than $600 a week. So I think that higher minimum wage is already being set by the market itself. So even though it's not official in a federal level, I think this stimulus money increase the bargaining power for labor force out there. And we are seeing that. I mean, for sure in New Jersey, I don't think anybody is being paid anymore at that minimum wage. So the bargaining power for workers have increased in terms of wages.
Yeah, I saw McDonald's just came out with an announcement, I think last week, that they raised the minimum wage for their managers as well as for their entry level, the employees that work at the counter and prepare the food, because of the labor shortage, and simply because they feel that it's that's the best way to attract employees. Again, that's a whole nother argument. It's funny, I did a podcast episode on that with one of your colleagues. We talked about universal basic income. We talked about minimum wage. So I know that might be interesting to really spend a longer episode on. So, yeah. But what we're seeing is that one other thing I saw here is the Monmouth came out with a poll, Monmouth University, and it says 71% of respondents expressed concern that President Biden's spending proposals could drive inflation, compared with 28% who said they weren't concerned at all. Even though they were concerned that a majority supported his proposal to spend trillions on traditional infrastructure projects like bridges and roads and for anti-poverty measures like childcare, education, and paid leave. So it seems that people are concerned this increased spending, government spending, but then again, support it. So again, I think it's a question of, I think the average person doesn't really understand it the way you understand it. So that's why it's great to explain it the way you're explaining it.
Phil, again, when you are at the late, when you see job positions not being filled quickly, at least it's taking time to hire somebody because you cannot find labor force. I mean, that's a pretty good red flag that you need to be careful with spending. You don't want to put even more money into the economy because how are you going to increase the production? So then you need to attract people to come and work for you, and that's going to feed even more into inflation. So I think at least based on my understanding, we first need to fix this issue of encouraging or increasing labor force participation. We need to figure it out how to encourage people to come back to workplaces and join the labor force, and then go with, I think now is the big discussion in infrastructure bill and improve infrastructure in the US. So which is another thing that will pressure the demand in the economy.
I think the stimulus plan money runs out, I think September. I think there's the additional unemployment benefits or the stimulus checks. So that may be a natural way to get people who may be sitting at home making more money, collecting checks and going to work. And I'm not saying that's 100% of the people, because there are people that have children at home or
exactly
can't work. They may be dealing with COVID or their place where they used to work. So it's a myriad of issues. But once it gets political, of course, we're so hyper political in this country that each party uses what they want to use. So it's a bigger. There's a lot more issues other than that. So
I totally agree. That's why I'm saying it's not the solution. I don't say they'll just put more money into the economy, but also just saying, oh, people need to join the labor force. I mean, people are getting scared. I mean, still we have the COVID around us. So, I mean, that's why until you make people feel confident and until people feel pretty secure, hey, when I go out, I'm not going to get infected. I'm going to pretty much get very comfortable. Then we need to talk about more spending. But the way it's going, I don't know. I think we are going to see some more inflation, at least in a couple of months.
Yeah, and I didn't mention, you and I are speaking on July 19th right now. So, and we're seeing an increase in cases in the US. Every state, I think, has seen an increase over the past couple of weeks. So this Delta variant has now, it's about 70% of all the new cases are Delta variant. It seems it's more infectious and it's more transmittable. So again, we don't know what's going to happen. Hopefully the cases subside, but it looks like we're on that path of increased cases, which leads us into the fall. So we could have this nightmare scenario again, where things may start shutting down different states and we might get back to the mask. So just like we thought we were out of this, we may be going back into it, maybe not as severe as it was last year because of the vaccinations in this country, albeit not extremely high, but I think it's around 50% are fully vaccinated, which should be a lot higher. But we're kind of leading into the unknown of what's going to happen even a month from now, let alone 6 months from now. So
definitely, and Phil, also policy making comes with a lot of unknowns too. That's why it's hard to blame. Personally, I don't take a stand of blaming a specific politician because personally, I feel all this stimulus money was with a good intention. Like, hey, people are locked down, lost their job. We need to finance their spending and everything else. So then every policy making comes with some sort of unintended consequences too. So personally, I do not believe any policymaker intended inflation out there, but it's something that came up because there was a lot of disruption in the supply side, but also we open, I feel, pretty quickly, which also policymakers couldn't predict that we are going to open, because to me it was pretty fascinating how we went from March, people were scared, and in April and just everything opened up, and now we jump into May, oh, no masks being required, so everything went so fast. And also for the policymakers too, it's not easy to sort of observe all these things that are happening.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I was a proponent of the stimulus money because we needed it. I mean, the Americans had lost their job. It wasn't their fault that they lost their jobs. Exactly. It was their store or company shut down. But like anything else, it gets political because we have the midterm elections coming up next year. So of course, this is a political football now, and each party, the Democrats are claiming, they're saying it was successful, the Republicans saying it was a failure. And there's the other part of this, which I did an episode with Dr. Axelrod. We talked about stimulus money, because to the average American, we think like, oh, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, who cares? We have the money because we're basically printing our own money. Exactly. What are the implications of this $2, $3, $4 trillion spending into the economy? How does that impact the dollar? How does it impact spending and the credit and the interest rate? So there's that other part of it that I think most of us don't know, who don't really understand it, that how you would understand as an economist, that there are implications to all this additional spending on to different areas. So.
And you brought a good point. I was overseas, as we talked earlier. So I was overseas, and because all this money was put into the economy, think about the supply of dollar increased drastically. And when the supply of something goes up, then the price of that currency is going to drop. So we had depreciation of the dollar, and it directly affected me, because when I was in Europe, I had to exchange those dollars into euro. And I can feel, when I was comparing it from before, I can feel the pain of the depreciation, because now for me, everything was looking more expensive because I had to give up more dollars per each product I was buying in Europe too. So,
yeah. You mentioned the housing market, and we're hearing all these stories of housing, which is seeing 20, 30, 40% increase in housing prices, where people are bidding higher than asking price. I read a story last week that somebody was selling their house, and they actually had 100 people online waiting to see their house at a showing. And we're hearing all these crazy stories of people just will do. And I have friends that just sold their homes and sold it for 20, 30% more than asked. It's insane. So this is not sustainable. But before I answer that question, 2008, the whole housing market collapsed. People are afraid that's going to happen now. But from what I read, that wouldn't, because there's a lot of regulations in place so that won't happen again. Because everyone's afraid of this housing bubble, like it's going to happen 2008 again, but it wouldn't, right? I mean, doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
I don't think so. And I think now we are in a much better position than what we were, let's say, last year in March, April. At least, even if COVID cases pick up, we are aware of COVID works. So at least we got some experience out of COVID. So Phil, again, that's another thing, that we had the pandemic, we had the shutdown, but we still receive income. So there was no sort of deferral in, let's say, it's not was like I couldn't pay my mortgage, which people still were able to pay their mortgage, and that kind of stopped something like 2008 and 9 happening. And that not decreasing prices also saved people too, because there was no encouragement to default to. If I see the value of my house picking up, then why should I default? I can just hold into my house, which was the opposite of what happened in 2008 and 9, where people saw the value of their houses dropping, and that kind of created a cycle of default rates picking up and making the crisis even worse. So to me, Phil, I do not foresee something like that happening. But what I'm trying to see, or what the way I'm understanding is, when I see the value of my house picking up, then a lot of people refinance. I refinanced myself too. So now you are refinancing against an asset that appreciated in value, which means now you can get more money as a loan, and then you can use that extra income for, I don't know, buying stuff or buying something else, which is another channel that it's adding to the demand in the economy. So that's why, at least the way I'm looking at the inflation, it's not just one sector. It's not just blaming a specific, let's say, stimulus money. There's a lot going on in terms of appreciation of assets that I think now we are seeing feeding into appreciation of goods in terms of prices.
Yeah, and this is unprecedented. We've never had a pandemic like this before. So what's happening now would nothing compare to. So
and Phil, I mean, I teach macroeconomics. You can see every U.S. recession is not the same. So we tend to see the history repeats in terms of recession, but it's not. Like 2008 was housing bubble, and we have the tech bubble 2001. So you can see there is no source of the recession the same, which makes it interesting, but also hard to predict what's going to happen afterwards.
And the Fed, I think the Fed came out as stated that they're going to raise short-term interest rates in 2022 or 2023. I saw their notes that came out a couple of weeks ago.
So that's I think the Fed is under pressure right now because they are seeing these numbers of inflation rate, which is troublesome for Fed. Because uh, think about this. So if I see inflation, the only channel for Fed is to raise interest rate, make the credit more expensive, or kind of pull out to all this liquidity that they have added in the economy, and that can be pricey because pretty much the cost we pay as an economy when we try to fight inflation is a slowdown in the economy. But there's no free lunch, Phil. That's what we keep teaching, and it's you have to pay a price somewhere if you want to fight a specific issue that the society is facing.
It's, you know, I'm an American, I can say this, I guess, but it's Americans, like we just don't want to wait for things. You know, everything takes 3 or 4 weeks now, or you order something where it typically come in 2 days, and now it's taking 3 weeks to come because of the supply chain and the supply and demand because of COVID. And it's, you know, you hear stories on, I just mentioned the Starbucks, and a friend of mine was complaining, saying that he used to order this certain iced tea at Starbucks, and now they don't have it anymore. It's still for like another month or so because of, I guess, wherever they got the tea from is backed up. And he was so angry and upset. And I said to him, like, really? Like, come on, like, drink a different iced tea. But I think that's part of people getting angry and saying, let's put things in perspective. You know, I know nobody wants to pay more for things, but you could wait an extra month or two to drink your iced tea, or, you know, that car that you want, maybe it may take 4 weeks to come from the factory instead of 1 week. So I don't know. I see you laughing, so I could tell.
No, because I'm comparing to where I come from, and this is where I feel people get too comfortable in US.
Yeah.
And this is where visiting some other countries can help you. I tell my students, like, if you do not appreciate US, then just go visit some other countries, and you come back and you say, oh my God, I love this country. And
it's true.
And you will complain less.
It's true, because we're complaining about things that are so insignificant. So.
Because things, again, perfection is a relative concept, but things you can do here in 1 day in terms of, I don't know, paying stuff, doing all this, whatever things you need to do in some other countries can take days. Like, you have to go there, wait in line, see if it works. Then there's a lot that goes in terms of labor force, and there's just a little bit you will achieve with all that time being spent. Whereas here, personally, I feel like I can achieve a lot of things just through my phone, and which, I don't know, makes me feel much more comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, you know, this article in the Fortune magazine was also pointing out, and again, this is common. You know, cars, for example, there's a chip company, and they're backed up on manufacturing orders. So the auto companies are starting to get back to receiving regular chip shipments. So cars going back in the market, so prices come back in line. But a simple thing as a computer chip that now is ubiquitous in cars, if that takes 4 weeks to distribute to the car companies instead of the typical 3 days, you know, cars aren't being manufactured. They're sitting on the line, and you know, car dealerships don't have cars to sell. I went through this 6 months ago, went to buy a new car, and it took 2 months just to locate one, and it was in New York, where typically you just go to a car dealership and they have plenty of cars. So like you mentioned, it's happening across all different industries. It's not one industry in particular. It's happening to everyone.
And totally right. So because of that, I said, oh, let me go and check the CPI specifically for used car and trucks. And as I mentioned earlier, it's like a 40%, I think it was 40-something% increase in the prices of the used car. Just the reasoning is because of what you just mentioned, like there's a shortage of chips for the new cars. So new cars are not being produced, and now that demand is going toward the used car, and now the value of used car has increased drastically. And I read there was 2 days ago this article in Financial Times where the guy said, I had the car for 1 year, and then for whatever reason, he went back to the dealership to ask for a part, and the dealership said, we are willing to buy the car back for a couple $1,000s more than you bought it. So even though you hold it for a year, then he still was able to sell it back for a couple $1,000 more, and just because of this lack of production of the new car.
Yeah, my wife has a car that's about 7 years old, and her dealership that she bought it from 7 years ago just sent us a letter last week saying that they want to buy the car back from her. I forget how much higher than it's normally worth, like 20% more than the average price of it, simply for the reason you stated, that they don't have new cars to sell. They're trying to sell used cars because they're at a premium now. They're even more attractive than, because they can't sell them.
Again, I'm thinking if we have to work more from home, then probably it's worth it too.
Yeah, exactly.
Take the risk of selling the used car.
So let's, my last question, and we'll wrap up our episode here is, so, what would you do as an economist? I mean, obviously what's happening in this country with inflation. What are some of the things you would do now, assuming that COVID is under control? Because again, we don't know what's going to happen in a month or 2 months from now, but considering July 19th right now, what would you do?
So, Phil, there is a lot going on now. When there is inflation, there is no incentive to hold cash at all, because inflation is eating up the value of your savings. So now, personally, I will try to hold assets, and one of the assets which might be relatively safe would be treasury bonds, especially treasury bonds that are indexed to inflation rate, what we call the TIPS assets, the treasury inflation protected securities. So that's one solution. Another solution would be hold other assets, let's say house, or buy something other than cash when it comes to that. The other thing is working for an employer that at least offers you the COLA agreement, where at least if there is an inflation rate, your wages adjust accordingly to that. Other than that, again, inflation creates a lot of uncertainty, because with inflation rate, we see interest rates picking up. With higher interest rate, we see the stock market responding negatively to that, that's why I'm trying to be hesitant into saying jump into stock market, because inflation rate is not a good news for the stock market. But at least if you let's say you buy a second house, or you buy any other asset out there, then at least that the value of that asset will appreciate with the inflation rate. At least your savings are protected out of the inflation. Otherwise, it's hard, because seeing the value of your savings kind of losing value with inflation rate is not something that you get happier. So, but it's a risk factor we have to pay, and that's why inflation is called a risk factor.
Yeah, and I think over the next couple of months, we'll get an idea of where COVID is going to happen, whether it settles or as it increases, because again, it's going to impact everything. Right now, it's uncertain. About a month ago, we felt good about COVID here in the U.S. because we were, the trend line was going down with cases. Now we're starting to go back up again, and hopefully we start leveling out. But if we don't, and you and I can have a different conversation in September and October than we're having now.
Definitely.
So, that may spur more stimulus money. It may cause some lockdowns. Again, it's hopefully that doesn't, we don't get to that point. So, but
yeah.
No, I appreciate the talk. For those of you who are listening, I encourage you to check out our other podcast episodes on our Business Edge. There are several others that are as great as what we just talked about. And I appreciate your time, and we look forward to our next episode. So thanks again, Ed.
Thank you so much, Phil. I appreciate it.